Okay, good evening, everyone. A warm welcome on this wet evening at King's. So, alumni and guests, thank you for coming out in this bad weather to KCLA's annual lecture, annual address, and a particular welcome to any of those who are attending one of our events for the very first time, and a welcome to our returning guests. I hope that that's not going to be the last time, first and last time, that we see you if you're visiting for us here for the first time. I'd also like to welcome Professor Trembleth, who's here, Senior Vice President of Health and Life Sciences at King's College, Executive Director of King's Health Partners, and he's representing the Vice Chancellor, Shitjish Kapoor, who's not able to be with us today. You will have seen behind we've got the screen going with, we've had a video going before. This is all being videos and will be on our YouTube channel at a later date. We're due to finish around 8:15, at which time there will be a reception in the foyer or the council room upstairs. You are all welcome to join us for that, a glass of wine and some nibbles, and I hope you will be able to stay. Let me introduce myself first before I introduce our speaker. I'm Diana Garnham. I'm president of the King's College London Alumni Association. We're a voluntary organisation, now more than 100 years old, and we organise events and activities that enable King's alumni and staff to remain connected and engaged with other alumni and with the college. There's a very broad range of activities. Many people who lead those activities are sitting in the room. But the sorts of things that we do range from subject-based network groups that work with departments, reunions, mutual support groups, sports, celebrations of the history and contribution of King's to society, and we celebrate individual alumni accomplishments. All alumni of King's, that's nearly 300K, are eligible for membership. And we can't stay in touch with everybody, but if you'd like to register and stay in touch with us, please do so. I think there are cards with QR codes on them which will take you directly to our sign-up form. I hope you will take the opportunity to do that tonight. The KCLA annual address is an opportunity for us to invite prominent alumnus to reflect on their role. Our speakers of the past years have been from many different fields: law, culture, science, international affairs. And our speaker tonight is certainly one of the most influential individuals in her field of health, of nursing and health policy. She's certainly an alumna we're very proud of. She's also the immediate past president of KCLA. So Dame Anne-Marie Rafferty is among the best-known contemporary nurse researchers in the world, I think. She's currently Professor of Health and Nursing Policy here at King's College and is a former Dean of the Florence Nightingale School of Nursing and Midwifery. Having followed her mother into nursing, she moved on from clinical practice and now holds a doctorate in modern history, the subject of the politics of nursing knowledge, as well as a degree in nursing studies and a master's in clinical research. I believe she was the first nurse to be awarded a DPhil from the University of Oxford. Anne-Marie has been in the forefront of thinking and ideas about nursing in the NHS, more or less since the turn of the millennium. She's passionate about the need to look across all clinical professions and skills in the health service and has spoken publicly about the need to unlock the potential of the nursing workforce. Anne-Marie has championed both the potential of nurses being engaged in research and the need for research into nursing and nursing practice. I remember well listening to her strength of view on this when I was at the Association of Medical Research Charities, and I was one of those that she wanted to influence. Anne-Marie is admired across the nursing professions and was selected as one of the 70 nurses to celebrate the NHS's 70. She's also respected and listened to beyond nursing and is able to influence other clinical colleagues and policymakers. Awards and recognition of her talents are very broad. She's a Fellow of the Royal College of Nursing, where she was also President from 2019 to 21, a Fellow of the American Academy of Nursing, and, unusually I think for a nurse, there aren't that many there, at the UK Academy of Medical Sciences. Having won a Harkness Fellowship to study at the University of Pennsylvania, she worked on the role of nursing in the Clinton administration's healthcare reforms. She's been a contributor to many of the NHS reviews over the years, including with Lord Ara Darcy on the Next Stage Review in 2008, the Prime Minister's Commission on the Future of Nursing and Midwifery 2009-10, the Parliamentary Review of Health and Social Care in Wales in 2018, is a member of the NHS Assembly and currently a member of the Times Health Commission. In 2020, she was appointed Dame Commander of the British Empire for services to nursing, a mightily well-deserved honour. Her research into healthcare workforce was the first to establish a link between nursing staffing and patient mortality rates in the UK, and she's designed the Culture of Care Barometer, which I suspect she may reference later. So a very warm welcome from all of us and from KCLA to you, Anne-Marie, and I invite you now to speak to us on the NHS at 75, Dilemmas and Prospects.
Well, thank you, Diana, for that very warm and generous introduction. And it's wonderful to be amongst friends, may I say. And actually, I never really thought I would be on this side of the podium because not so long ago, I was introducing Diana for her lecture at the Royal Society, and that was a great, great event. But it is a true honour and thrill to be here this evening. And a massive thanks to colleagues, to Barry and to Diana for their choreography of this event, the team behind the scenes who've helped to make this happen. And I just want to talk to you this evening, actually, despite my kind of background and perhaps even baggage, I'm not going to say very much about nursing, so there's not going to be much ado about nursing. I'm going to really focus on the NHS itself. And you heard the video of Clement Attlee in 1946, the night before the NHS, on the 5th of July, was actually being announced. And it was Attlee rather than Bevan who made that particular announcement. And what's significant about that video is that it lays out the 6 areas which he said were contributing to the provision of social security. Incidentally, social security in that guise was a term that was a phrase that was actually invented by Winston Churchill. And Attlee's views of social security were really fired up and born during his work in the coalition government during World War II. And so he was a very articulate, I think, an expert spokesman on that topic. But it was actually, as we know, an Iron Bevan, coal miner turned Titanic politician, who actually did the political wrangling. It's all very well having a plan that people even agree on, but it's quite another thing to actually get that plan put into legislation and actioned. And Bevan was the great navigator, if you like, who managed to steer that bill ultimately into an act through the tempestuous discussions that happened in the House of Commons, and the debates were fierce and ferocious because the opposition on many fronts was too. And it's interesting that a year later, during this, another link you can click on the BBC archives, is the speech that Bevan gave after 1 year into the National Health Service, which he really mounted a very strong defence against the naysayers who were still trying to kind of chip away at what he had fundamentally mounted as, you know, a great and bold experiment. And in many ways, it anticipates what has happened to the NHS since. It really has become something of a martyr in the manner of Saint Sebastian, a martyr in a state of perma-crisis, having slings and arrows shot at it from all directions. And that's the way the NHS started, and that's somewhat the way that it has actually remained. I got this photograph when I was recently in Copenhagen and thought that's going to be a nice one. Picture to keep people entertained. So what I want to really argue this evening, and to convince you of, that the dilemmas that we now experience in the NHS, the tensions and the trade-offs, were actually baked into the system from the very beginning, and they have remained so in different guises and perhaps in different weights and balances. I want to focus on how those dilemmas have really driven some of the funding issues and the priorities that we now look to lead us forward in the NHS. Then look at some options and prospects for the future. So what are these dilemmas? Well, I've got 5 of them here. The first one is localism versus centralism. Wow, there was a big debate about that at the beginning. Herbert Morrison and Nye Bevan battling it out. Herbert Morrison was Minister for Local Government, and he, incidentally, I think he's actually the grandfather, maybe the great-grandfather of Peter Mandelson. You can check that up on Google as I speak and correct me. But he was a great advocate of local authorities, the centre of gravity for policymaking and management of the NHS should be in local authorities. Well, Bevan said no, because local authorities, as you will probably know, had different levels of wealth attached to them. If you're in a posh and wealthy area, you could do a lot more than if you're in a really deprived area. And of course, this was Bevan's experience coming from an impoverished background in Wales. He thought this is just going to reinforce inequalities. We can't have that. So he wanted to pool the kind of locus and the anchor for funding and for direction and leadership to the centre and make it a function of state and the Ministry of Health. So Morrison lost and Bevan won, but we could really ask ourselves the question, would it have been better if Morrison had actually won? Here we are now, we're developing integrated care systems. We're wanting to knit everything together and build an infrastructure that links the local and the community with the central. We hear so much criticism of top-down command and control. So the counterfactual argument is actually quite interesting to consider. Maybe we'll talk about that at the end. Hospital versus community. Bevan raised this question in the House of Commons and in his speech a year after the service was launched. A national hospital system, it was criticised. And this binary with a community, it seems as if we have been everlastingly trying to ditch the hospitals and their influence and push care out into the community. There's not a policy document comes forth, but it doesn't actually spout forth the same mantra. But what has happened, in fact, as I'll demonstrate, is that hospitals have become even more hungry and powerful in relation to their resource base. They have gobbled up these resources, and the poor communities are skint and actually really, really struggling, especially in community nursing, which has seen swinging cuts. Prevention versus care. Well, again, if we go back to the Dawson report of 1918, there was a beautiful scheme laid out by Lord Dawson of Penn of primary, secondary and tertiary care. He borrowed the terminology from education, thanks to civil servants who were trying to kind of influence his thinking, Lord Morant in particular. But prevention has been something that's, again, it becomes a kind of mantra of policy. We must prevent, we must intercede and interject upstream rather than after the fact when illness has already happened. That's what's going to give us all the cash savings. But actually, it's quite difficult to demonstrate that prevention does save lives, because even if you prevent, people go on to develop other illnesses. So it's not popular necessarily with policymakers. So again, this kind of tussle between prevention and actually reacting once things have happened still remains. Public versus private. Well, there's one for the moment. Critics argue that we are privatising the National Health Service, and to some extent, the porosity, if you like, of the gatekeeping has really widened. And we certainly have more providers. There's certainly more care spent on private providers providing NHS care. Before the pandemic, it was about one NHS pound in 10. Now it's 1 in 7. So it's going up. Now, is that creeping privatisation, or is that just realpolitik and necessity? But it's interesting as well to think that the NHS didn't suddenly begin to become private, more open to private providers. You know, general practitioners are private providers, entrepreneurs, business people. It's always had a large chunk of private sector interest in it, and so it will probably remain. Professional versus the public voice. Well, this is probably more to do with governance and accountability. You know, our disdain for experts now is a relatively new phenomenon. But of course, our doctor friends fought ferociously to have a seat at the table. And because there's 17 Royal Colleges, they got 17 seats at some of the tables. So there was a huge kind of push in the political horse trading around whether doctors were going to sign up, particularly GPs. Consultants were more canny and comfortable, I think, with being in a salaried service because they thought it would give them some stability because they were paid in a different way through the voluntary hospitals. They had to earn most of their keep through private practice. Voluntary hospitals like King's and St Thomas's and Guy's. So the professional voice and expertise, including management expertise, versus the lay voice, there's always been a bit of a kind of tension between these. And now we have, you know, watchdogs such as Health Watch, keeping an eye on that lay voice, and colleagues in the audience know how important it is for patients and their families to speak up and raise concerns. This is a massive thing, especially after the Mid-Staffordshire catastrophes in care. So look at where we now stand in relation to our cherished NHS. It's the epitome of what it means to be British. And I think that's a really interesting kind of phenomenon. It's, you know, beats all of these other indicators here. More important than the arts, which is a huge industry, very successful, 43 billion, you know, income. It's more important than the royal family. So, you know, the NHS is top of the pops still in what it actually means to be British. And it's also underneath that, the subtext is because it's free at the point of delivery, and it's also paid by taxes. It's still paid by taxes. And the last time we had a review, Alan Maynard, in the Blair government, a major report on hypothecated taxes, that's taking a single tax and applying it to healthcare. Wouldn't that be great? Everyone thought, well, no, actually, because it has a greater administrative burden, and actually you're better off still chopping on income tax. So it does make people proud to be British, the NHS, and free at the point of delivery and funded by taxation. But there is a kind of but here. A lot of the public think that in the future this may not continue. We are going to have to revert to some form of co-payments, and that's over 50%. And so that is how it may go, and I'd love to hear from you what you think about that, and perhaps we'll have an opportunity to discuss that in questions. The other sceptical note, although we all love the NHS, and it is the closest thing, according to Nigel Lawson, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, that Britain has to a religion. Well, the last time we had a major upheaval of religion was the Reformation in the 16th century. And, you know, it doesn't look like it's easy at all to have a total radical overhaul of the NHS either. But there is a mood, I think, to make some changes. How fit for purpose? Is it in relation to meeting the needs of an ageing population? Well, some people are sceptical, probably through experience. Be great to hear your views. Climate change, keeping up with new tech, and responding, as we're hearing with the COVID inquiry, to future pandemics. But voters are also split on what is causing the strain on services. And as we can see to the right, the red dot is Labour, the blue is the Tories. Lack of funding is the fundamental issue, diagnostically according to Labour. No, it's not, say the Tories. Poor government policy, say Labour. No, it's not, of course, those incumbents of government say. Poor NHS management. This is another Saint Sebastian. Poor managers are always getting maligned and hammered, especially by the right-wing press. Staff shortages. Well, I think many of us, of course, been spending our lives, my colleagues Jill Mabin and others, and Ruth Harris from our faculty as well, been, chipping away at this over the years, trying to prove this kind of point and the costs and consequences of underfunding in staffing. Increased demands from an ageing population, efficiency, Brexit. Wow, yes, Labour say that's a major cause. Not as big, though, as underfunding, and of course the Tories would say otherwise. Increased immigration, again, a right-wing view, if you like, from our colleagues in the Home Office. So I think, the majority of British people, though, do believe that the NHS is sort of fundamental. It's knitted into the DNA of British society, and we should do everything to maintain it, although it does have some caveats, depending on how you frame those questions, as we've actually seen. But look at how we've expanded, even although we've got that slide with staff shortages, look at how staffing has ballooned over time. 68,000 nurses at the beginning of the service, and now full-time, this was 2018, 217,000 is actually a bit more than that now. And nearly 12,000 doctors and 115,000 overall. Doctors have actually expanded at a greater rate than the nurses, and that's quite important because actually doctors drive a lot of nursing work, So that's an interesting kind of conundrum. Is that the right balance? I mean, I think some of us would say, not denying that we need more doctors, but actually, the nursing investment needs to be even greater. But impressively, I think, looking at the metrics, there's 1.3 million GP appointments every year. Nearly 600,000 babies are delivered every year. 4.4 million referrals to specialists, a workforce, the largest workforce in the country, actually, one of the 5 largest workforces in the world, 1.2, and growing. Managers, and managing 24, nearly 5 million accident emergency appointments and 95 million contacts in community services. I mean, that's a huge achievement, but it still doesn't seem to be enough. There are quizzings, there are questions, there are thoughts and reflections to be had. And what the consequences of all of this have been that the budget has also ballooned. It's risen, escalated since its origins. And the shift, if you like, in the proportion of public expenditure that it's absorbing from 11.2 in 55 to 6 to 30%, and actually growing now. It's reckoned that by 2030, it could be as high as 50% of public expenditure, and 2050, 70%. So that's a bit eye-watering if we continue at the same rate. But even then, it might still not be enough. So, prescription charges. Shall we make co-payments? Well, we did that in 1951. It led to the resignation of Harold Wilson and Nye Bevan. So they were definitely opposed to any charges of any kind because it would impact on the poor adversely and disproportionately. Actually, prescription charges don't really generate that much. It's around 600 million. You think, is it worth the candle and the trouble? Anyway, we've got them now, so taking that away would be a huge political bun fight. And the early custodians of the NHS and its critics were concerned that, gosh, the expenditure's running away. Every year, Bevan was having to go to the Treasury for subventions and ask, take his begging bowl and ask for more money. And so the government of the day, the Conservative government in 1956, set up the Guillebaud Committee. Claude Guillebaud, Cambridge economist, set about trying to look at the cost of the National Health Service. This was the first report of its kind, aided and abetted by a very young economist called Brian Abel-Smith, that some of you may have heard of, who used to be based across the road in LSE. And what did they find? Well, the government was hoping they'd find extravagance everywhere. But instead, they found severe underfunding and decrepitude in capital, which we're still dealing with, and many other, and services, uneven provision. But the main mantra was, there simply is not enough money going into the system. Well, that taught the government, not keen on having another inquiry into the costs of the National Health Service. Doesn't give you the answer you want, necessarily. But look at hospital beds, how that's changed. Nearly 500,000 at the beginning of the service, a lot. Of course, you had loads of small hospitals. And now we are the outlier in Europe. We have the smallest number of hospital beds. Is that why A&E's been crammed and crowded out? It's part of the equation. And we do need to increase the number of hospital beds that we're actually providing, because it's quite clear that we don't have enough. So then Enoch Powell came along in 1962 as Minister of Health. Many praised Enoch Powell as Minister of Health. We may not agree with his views on immigration, his famous speech, but actually he's lauded to be a good Minister of Health. He put forward the hospital plan to expand the numbers of hospitals beyond 40, which Boris Johnson did, and actually to review the whole estate and hospital stock, because he thought, and was right to say, it was, a ramshackle edifice, virtually unchanged since the Victorian times, and began a building programme. So many of the hospitals that we visit today are creations from that hospital plan. And alongside that, of course, we've seen vast improvements in life expectancy. I mean, how many of us would, be here if we'd been born, and come in our prime, if you like? I consider we're in our prime, in 1948. So yes, 79, nearly 80 for men, and 83, just over 83 for women now, up from 65 and 70. But infant mortality proportionately, plummeting. That's good news. These are good news stories. But it's quality of life, living well, isn't it? It's not just actually living, and longevity that's important. Many infectious diseases have disappeared. Polio. Vaccination has been a huge success story as well over the years. So the NHS has, managed to roll out these programs of prevention of infectious diseases. But now, of course, we have other challenges. We have chronic multimorbidity to contend with. And, you can see the proportions here. For heart disease, it's nearly 30% of the causes of mortality in 48 and nearly 16 now. Heart disease, cancer and stroke are still the biggest killers, with 4 of the major lifestyle factors: diet, smoking, alcohol and exercise. We do have control over some of these elements, and that's what dealing with chronic disease actually means, is intervening with all of those simultaneously, probably. But if we look at the assets and where the NHS has been in terms of its funding, we look at the OECD average here. And then we see that we've had this kind of, parabola, a peak with, has to be said, the Blair and Brown years. And then look at that massive dip. No wonder we're in a real mess now. That legacy of austerity is still very much with us. Waiting lists alongside that. There has been rationing. There has been a backlog that has been building up ere long, and it is increasing. It's really interesting, 7.3 million on the waiting list. But people are now arguing, actually, it should be a lot more. Some people are estimating that it should be something in the region of 18 million. Can you imagine? So where are people? That's not that different from what it was pre-pandemic. So are people just not going to health service? What is going on? It's a little bit of a puzzle. Now, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but it just gives you the top line here. We're now at nearly 190 billion. That's been building steadily and rapidly. And that's partly due to the pandemic, that boost there. But the average, increase has been very, very modest. It's not enough to keep up with the demands. If we look at this politically, we see, Thatcher and major governments were very, very average, 3%. The big boost came with Brown and Blair, and the coalition government, mean. Cameron, mean. A lot of meanness, it has to be said. And we reap what we sow in terms of investment. Capital investment. We've heard lots of stories about concrete, faulty concrete and hospitals falling apart. And if we look at where this spending has actually, in real terms, it's been minuscule compared to the need, 0.7. And a little boost in an autumn statement isn't really enough to change that kind of trajectory. And so although it's been going up, there's been a huge kind of backlog to make up for the lost years. And I think it's shown here in terms of, the risk kind of profile, very severe. If you take significantly severe and the very severe, we are in deep trouble from not, our plant, our basic estate, our basic facilities. I was actually, a hospital that shall remain nameless in the northwest of London, and a patient that day had been being wheeled across a bridge, and a whole slab of plaster had actually fallen on the bed. I mean, it is literally falling apart. It's very, very worrisome. But, anything we put into the system as well, as Treasury will say, well, it just gets, gobbled up by inflation, because of the cost of living crisis. So you don't really get the same value in the return on that investment because of where we're actually situated economically as well. So the annual growth in the total health budget would be lower if higher inflationary pressures were also taken into account. And I think we can see that the GDP, and there are different answers basically according to whether we're using consumer price index or GDP. But basically, the galloping inflation that we've experienced has made a big dent on where those budgets have actually been going. And if we look again at the OECD and even the European average, which Tony Blair pledged when he famously stole Gordon Brown's budget on the Andrew Marr show, it's still actually below the European average. But we are within touching distance of that compared to France and Germany, who are up at 13 and 14%, and we are under, around 9-ish. We're still probably not, well, definitely not investing enough. But it is, it's a lot of money, 187 billion. There's the European average, it's 22,227. So if we want to catch up, we've got a lot further investment to do. Where's this money going to come from? And that's just the shortfall in the cumulative shortfall compared to other EU countries. You know, it's not a great story. It's not a very uplifting one. And similarly with beds, you know, per in doctor ratio, we are way below the European average. It's difficult to know what is. Again, it's always a question of balance in these kinds of questions, but being an outlier is probably not where we want to be. And this slide is from a study that we completed, and basically gives you some kind of readout on the things that matter in terms of investment in nursing, the level at which nurses are educated. So basically, better educated nurses to bachelor's level, undergraduate nurses give you better patient outcomes. Staffing and resourcing adequacy, richer skill mix converts into a quality of work environment, and burnout. Nurses will burn out if there's just not enough of them, and similarly express their intention to leave. So we are in the lower quartile of all our European peers and counterparts, and that is not a good place for nursing to be, which is a major part of infrastructure. And I think we can try and understand how we've partly got to this position by analysing the work of Mariana Mazzucato. She's an economist at UCL, and she talks about value in the economy. And what she's basically arguing, not dissimilar to Thomas Piketty in the history of capitalism, is that we have spent our money, if you like, investing in goods and services, but really prioritising shareholder value, an extraction industry of taking profits out and not reinvesting them back into the service, back into infrastructure, back into R&D, and back into human capital. And that has got to change if we are going to turn the productivity, the growth curve of the British economy, which feeds the public services around. And then, of course, we've had this rather innocent-looking character to contend with, but who's a menace globally as well. COVID, you know, was a great negative game changer in health services and societies. I mean, not just health, every single part of society, and was impacted. And so it's really wreaked havoc, I think, with our health services, but we have an opportunity as well to actually learn from some of the good things that happened during COVID. And we've got a huge legacy in the workforce with people have been depressed, long COVID, anxiety, PTSD, and we're not through the worst of it yet because we've got this huge backlog, which is probably a bit of a clinical iceberg. You know, a lot of it's probably still sitting below the surface. So what about the sunnier uplands of prospects? I hope I am not depressing you all too much. Well, you know, the life sciences is a really important area where Britain is a leader. And it's not just in terms of biological sciences, and Richard and others can talk very eloquently about this, and gene editing and so genomics. It's also in terms of tech, AI. We are a world leader, and actually bringing these two things together through the tech industry and the life sciences, we have a great opportunity to use that to intervene earlier in disease and really get these diagnostics really rolled out. We're hearing of new developments, blood tests for cancer, etc., developing every day. And, you know, the game plan is to become a real destination for the life sciences, but it needs political will, resourcing, and strong leadership to help propel that forward. And that's what King's Health Partners is all about. And, you know, King's is very much part of a kind of intersection. I'll talk a little bit about SC1 with Southwark and Lambeth as well. Ringing, you know, networking, setting up a new AI institute. I think there's lots of ways in which the academic and the clinical are really collaborating and having, incubation of the benefits of life science investment in our own backyard. And I think this is a really interesting one, citizen science, and getting a kind of multiplier effect from citizens signing up to the Zoe app. Many of us were using that during COVID. It was developed for nutritional cohort studies, but now it's doing all manner of things. And, really growing that citizen science base where we are active participants in our own scientific kind of investigation, which hopefully will yield benefits as well. So it's a great, I think it's a great resource. I mentioned SC1, an innovation district on our doorstep, and that is really where the tech and clinical and innovation is all coming together. And it's a great model, and it needs to be kind of tended and looked after and have sustainable funding, I think, probably to provide the benefits. We've got our students, we've got our grants, we've got our clinical partners and the turnover, 40,000 workers in our neighbourhood, and nearly 5 million patient contacts. When you start to think about the digitisation, we've just been going through a major digitisation of electronic patient records. How that can be harvested, that data, if used appropriately, is kind of mind-boggling. But of course, we have to sustain our workforce and look after our workforce if we are going to succeed in this venture. They are, we are the infrastructure that around which everything pivots, including the NHS as an anchor organisation. In some parts of the country, it is, the major employer, somewhere like Portsmouth, for example. It's not just health, it's a health economy. It's the biggest employer. Being employed is one of the greatest if you like, protective shields against disease. And through procurement practices, using local transport networks, linking up with housing and hospitality, working with local business partners, and widening access to education in the locality and reducing our environmental impact. Anchor in the NHS is probably the major anchor institution. Sorry, using the Portsmouth example, the NHS plus the kind of the naval base in somewhere like Portsmouth are probably the two major industries, and they're all public sector. So I think there's a great role to play there, and that's what the integrated care systems are really kind of working through to be able to build on this anchor kind of approach to infrastructure development. And we also know that there's this correlation between health and wealth, and there's a new commission, the Health Prosperity Commission that the Institute of Public Policy is actually launching under Lord Ara Darcy and Dame Sally Davis. And it's making the case for investing in health as a kind of real spur to economic growth, providing data and evidence to support those arguments. I've put workforce, it could have been in the kind of dilemmas, and it is in the dilemmas bucket, but I have also put it in prospects because we have a long-term workforce plan to grow our clinicians, to develop apprenticeships, to open up access, and to really increase the NHS workforce by 300,000 by 2036 to 7. I mean, that's a huge ambition, and it's going to need a massive push from institutions like King's to be able to deliver that. There's doubling for doctors of medical places and shortening of the medical degree. That'll be interesting, needs to be evaluated, one would hope as well. And the trebling of nursing places, but probably still not enough. I would like to see much more investment in nursing, not just to the point of registration, actually to enable people to nurses to progress in career structures and regulating our advanced practice so that we can function at the top of our license. It needs bundles of interventions to all come together and the levers of power to be pulled all at once. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do. And famously, Sir Keith Joseph said that he'd longed for years to get his hands on the levers of powers. And when he got his hands on, he found out they weren't connected to anything. Well, sometimes it feels in the NHS that maybe not that they're not connected, it's just that they feel a bit kind of wobbly and shaky. And just in closing, I just wanted to reference a student commission on the future of the NHS that I had the privilege of working on with former Vice Principal from King's, Jonathan Grant, maybe known to some of you, with students from across the whole university, every faculty, every course, postgraduate, undergraduate, PhD students, all the subjects were represented. And it was supported by NHS England, and it was about future-proofing our NHS, a generational shift. So what do young people want for the future? We thought, we always ask old fogies like us, you know, what do you think in these surveys, etc. And they had interesting views. And one of the most significant, I think, was that we need to free, God love them, we need to free the NHS from politics, take it out of politics, stop it being a political football, and actually set up a body that was somewhat similar to what Gordon Brown did for the Bank of England, the Monetary Policy Committee. We need something similar that's neutral, that might be able to help move the dial on getting a less politicised NHS. Something perhaps similar to the OBR, the Office for Business Responsibility. So if we had something like the Office for the OBR and a commitment to actually empower the National Infrastructure Commission, just like President Biden has sunk $33 billion into infrastructure. We need an infrastructure bill. And I'm going to end on, you know, a pie-in to John Maynard Keynes, who was a great economist after the First World War, and of course produced the theory of employment, and, you know, very influential on using employment as a way to build back better in an economy and at a time of stringency and straitened circumstances. But Maynard Keynes was also for taxing appropriately. And, you know, we're still one of the, you know, we're a low tax economy, even though people think that we're paying, some people think we're paying far too much tax. So what I'm going to end on is arguing that we need more Maynard Keynes, less Milton Friedman. We need to pay more tax if we want European levels of services. The only way to do that is with British levels of funding. That's a non-equation. We are going to have to pay more tax. And on that possibly unpopular note, thank you very much indeed for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Anne-Marie. It was quite a tour de force of analysis of where the NHS has come from, where it's ended up. And we've got plenty of time for questions now, and Rashmi and Alison have got microphones. So if you'd like to ask a question, could you put your hand up? And while you're all having a think, I have to say I was quite struck by looking at your original model, thinking they got it wrong. So, because it didn't have the leadership structure in there in the same way that if you're setting up a core organisation for a nation, to think of what it will need for leadership in 30 years' time isn't in that original thinking, and they've let it bumble along, perhaps. But anyway, I won't ask you to answer. Well, it's just a comment at the moment.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to answer it until other people. Well, I suppose.
Yeah, let's take 3 at a time and see if you can group them together.
Okay.
So the lady there. Over there.
Yep. Can you hear
you've
me
got
all
the
right?
microphone.
Can you hear me with the mic?
Don't think, is it on?
The button's on. I can speak loudly.
It may not be working. Should we go, who's got the mic on this side? Yeah, shout. No, hang on.
It is working.
Right. Who's got the mic on this side?
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for that. I had a question with the long-term workforce plan in mind. How do you see the role of nurses, specifically specialty nurses, evolving to eliminate the backlog and also meet the demands of an aging population?
Can you say who you are and what course you did at King's?
Yes, my name is Kelsey Little, and I got my master's in global health at King's.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, is there one more question? Yeah? Yes, here.
Hi, I'm alumni environmental health many years ago here at King's. My point, I suppose, question point is, appreciate with regards to the funding, the community care, etc. But does public health, as in genuinely public health, not have a bigger part to play? I appreciate the whole care, prevention, etc. But if we look around what's going on currently in the country with the number of homeless individuals, poverty, inequality, and that's not just about the tone of the skin, but as a whole, if we're not getting the fundamental basics right, of course it will naturally put a strain on the NHS. And I think we are broken in that sense. We need to sort that. We can have lots more nurses, and we're going to have a greater number of people requiring the NHS. But until the foundations, the basics are sorted, the inequality is resolved, and people have a decent home to stay in and look after themselves, I think we're going to be in trouble and constantly chasing.
Thank you. Okay, that's quite a breadth.
Okay, so the first point, I should have had a pen here. The first point on the leadership, you probably wouldn't start from where people were, but there was, the tripartite structure of the National Health Service was left intact. It was a trichotomy between the voluntary hospitals, the hospital sector was intact. It was separated as well from the local authorities and then the general practice services themselves. So, and we've been trying to kind of everlastingly find a way to stitch those up together and integrate them now, So I think that has been an enduring legacy. And it's difficult to break into those kinds of cultures as, time goes on. But there were several reports. The Acton Trust in the 50s produced a report on leadership. When we got into regions and developed those, there were, conferences and think tank, the King's Fund, it was then the King's Edwards Fund for London. There was Nuffield Trust. They were looking at these issues. The back catalogue, I think, of reports is quite significant, but we are, I think, really seriously undermanaged as well as a National Health Service, and compared to, people are always, it's easy to kind of take potshots at managers, but compared to many other health systems, we just don't have enough. There's been Gordon Messenger's report and Stuart Rose's from Marks and Spencer's. We've had the military, we've had the commercials. Yeah, getting the if we had really, really good management and invested in it, but for some reason we just don't, because other priorities, I think, just seem to gallop along and take over, in this kind of mad steeplechase for funding. The point from Kelsey on nursing, thank you for singling out nurses and specialist nurses and, advanced practitioners, because there's a lot more that advanced practitioners could do, and, they've got lots of evidence, positive evidence on cost effectiveness in managing, multimorbidity and chronic disease. And I think that needs a big bolus. We need to regulate, so we don't have so many kind of over hundreds of job titles and job descriptions and employment practices in relation to these, and shoring them up in primary care as well. So I think making better use of what we've got and regularising advanced practice nurses, but it's going to take teams, as well, from, this working across with doctors and, allied health and pharmacists as well. So this is very much healthcare is a team sport, and I think helping people work more effectively in teams. But I think there's a lot that specialist nurses have given their heads, and prescribing in particular can actually help. We know that the evidence there is pretty strong. So thank you for that. Of course, public health has been a Cinderella, and poor, the poverty of investment in public health is itself a kind of symptom of this short-termism. I mean, that's one of the real issues in our problems, is the Treasury, the fiscal rules themselves have got to change to a much long-term view. And I think there's a general, there's a small consensus here, crystallising across different parties, that is something, unless it changes, we're just going to be repeating the patterns of the past. But yeah, and, public health, I think, has been a real football, hasn't it? It's been kicked around. I mean, local authorities, where's it going to go? Health security, who's in charge? I mean, omni-shambles. So let's get that right. I mean, I don't know whether you've got any confidence in the health security body that we have. It sounds great, but is it going to have the welly to really make inroads in the way in which you suggest? I'd be interested in your view.
Yeah, I was wanting to jump in after the first question about nursing specialists, because, of course, there's a great argument, rather fatuous argument going on in the medical profession at the moment because of the birth of a new animal, if that's the right word, and that's the so-called physician associates. And these are a group of people who are now entering the profession as practitioners working with doctors. And unfortunately, the doctors aren't reacting as well as they might do, and I've given them the rather horrible name of noctors, because they have been shown at times to be slightly dangerous in their practice, and the guidelines really for their practice is very, very difficult. They're uncontrolled in the sense that they don't have a GMC-like control body, although one is being created. But what I really want to try and say is that I think that we do need people like this with skills, clinical skills, who can support general practice and hospital doctors, particularly in accident emergency. And I really would, if you come across this argument, put forward the view that it should be supported, but it does need to be supported in a way that is proper. And I'll declare my interest. I've got a son who's training as a physician associate, and I'm a retired consultant physician.
Thank you. And then one over on the far side. That's all right, Stephen.
Shall I go first? So, Stephen Challicum, a past chair of KCLA, and somebody who spent his life in the NHS. First of all, Anne-Marie, thank you very much. Very thought-provoking, and a wide range of things. And as you know, the challenges facing the NHS are multifactorial. And I want to just touch on another one. We've talked a lot about the finance, but finance itself doesn't automatically equal productivity or quality. And I've been very concerned over the last few years of the lack of evidence for quality. And the need for outcome measures, clinical outcome measures. So, for instance, just having slightly less beds or more beds doesn't necessarily mean that we've got better quality of outcomes, that we're seeing more patients and we've got quality outcomes. I have to say, my firm belief is that every single patient coming into hospital should be part of outcome measures, should be measured so we know whether we're doing the good job. And I've been very concerned that we don't have the philosophy, we don't appear to have the philosophy amongst a lot of management in regards to the primary job of the NHS, which is to see patients and see them well. And if I made one small anecdote, at a well-known hospital, one of the ones you mentioned, as a matter of fact, in a recent induction for 22 managers, they were all asked to give their 3 major reasons that they would address, 3 questions, the most important things that they should address. That's 66 answers. Not one of them mentioned patients. So what I would like to see, that the whole philosophy, as I think this would be a fundamental change, that the philosophy of the management of the NHS is directed towards helping doctors and nurses and the clinical staff to see patients and see them with outcome measures, so we know that we're doing the best job. We might, in our patch, have the best hospitals in the country, the best outcomes, but we don't know that.
While you're moving the microphone, I might prompt my husband to share his anecdote about who is the NHS for. Share your anecdote of the research into who was the NHS for.
Do you really want me to do this?
I think you should.
I'm prepared to. I mean, it was a brilliant lecture, and I loved a lot of it. But the particular thing that Diana's asked me to refer to is that a few years ago I chaired something called the Quality Standards Task Group, which was looking at quality standards in the voluntary sector. And we were invited to compare ourselves with a lot of activities in Europe. And one of the features I'd love to pick up on another day with you, Anne-Marie, is just how Spain has managed to spend less and get more, but that's another conversation. But you've invited me, Diana, so I'm going to make the statement. So I was on platform when I was asked the question, who was the NHS for, assuming it was for the patient. And somebody turned round to me in public, on platform, and said, don't be so bloody stupid. The NHS is there for the medical consultant, and they're the people we have to keep happy. And dangerous though it be, I suspect there is a tiny element of truth there. And until the NHS does put the patient first and give the patient that voice that must be there, then I do think this sort of thinking can be quite dangerous. I'm not suggesting it's right, but it was reported to me openly and honestly at that moment. So an attempt to be controversial, I think, please.
But it followed on from Stephen's point about putting the patient centre stage. Right, we have another question over here, and then we'll take the 3 together.
Hi, my name is Heather. I did a PG in clinical education here, and background is nursing. I was just wondering about your opinions. There's all the things in the press we need. So many more nurses, we need so many more doctors, physios, everything. The thing that really worries me, though, is the fact that they are not nowadays seen as professions that people want to go into. I have a niece who is doing medicine as a second degree down in Portsmouth. Most of her cohort are already talking about going to Australia as soon as they qualify. I also help with a charity called Inspiring the Future, and I go to different schools and talk to children about nursing as a career. And I find it so sad that no matter how many schools I go to with different age groups, nursing is not a job that people want to go into. But also some of the other jobs as well within the health service are now no longer seen to be attractive. And it really worries me that we say we've got this massive shortfall, but where on earth are we going to get these people from?
Thank you. So 4 questions, 2 of which are about professionalism.
Hope I can remember all the questions.
Question about the
The
practice
associates.
assistants. Yeah.
Yes, the physicians' associates. Well, I think one point I'd like to make, I mean, it's interesting that this got through this time, because I remember being on a committee, gosh, I don't know, early 2000s, when the Royal College of Physicians was... Oh, sorry, can you hear me now? Okay, sorry, thanks. I remember so we've now got physicians' associates, but it's not the first time that it was advocated. A long time ago it was advocated, and it didn't get through the gate for various reasons. And I think it's really interesting adding in these support workers into the workforce, because we don't have a good track record in assimilating them, actually. And it's dash hard work doing that, because they have to be very, very closely supervised and understand their kind of boundaries, etc. And, you know, we have nursing associates, and there was some, you know, resistance to that. But actually, when you look at the evidence on the value of investing in support staff and thereby diluting the skill mix of the registered workforce, certainly, you know, in nursing, it shows that actually you get poorer outcomes. So this actually runs counter to the evidence base. You know, it's a richer skill mix that is needed. So that's my, you know, if we are going to do it, these people should be encouraged to become, you know, doctors or nurses as well, to actually come through the gate. It's a good route for widening access, but they've got to be properly looked after and, I think, you know, supervised and assimilated into the professions. That would be my thought on that. Now, Stephen's point on quality. Well, we're awash with data, aren't we, Stephen, on quality? We've got quality indicators coming out, at least in nursing, you know, right, left and centre, and we're kind of driving that forward. I mean, data systems in particularly hospitals are, you know, swamps. But it's the use of the data, I think, that is much less well targeted. And what data is really, you know, needed? We need a parsimonious approach and highly targeted approach to data that enables people to drive quality. And a lot of the data we use to drive quality is historic. You know, it dates back months, sometimes years. And so it's not really best suited to pushing forward and understanding. It's really used as a kind of reflection tool. And, you know, I think nurses are very exercised about that, and they spend a lot of their time trying to do projects on quality improvement whilst firefighting a lot of the time. So there's something definitely about the data systems. If this could be automated and we had real-time data, that would be absolutely brilliant. And maybe with the electronic patient record, that will actually help. But that's maybe a kind of fantasy that I'm having at the moment. And the question about careers. Well, yes. I mean, in a sense, these are really tough assignments, aren't they? I mean, shift work. That is, you know, going on nights, rotations. It mucks up your body clock. It is really, really, really hard. And, you know, we know the next generation X, Y, Z, whatever, they want lifestyles. They want a balance. You know, it's doing a discrete choice experiment, that's often number one that comes out when you ask people in healthcare, what do they want that's going to support their mental health? It is about balance at the end of the day. And we've got 12-hour shifts, you know, for nurses that are killers. You know, you're on your feet 12 hours, sometimes without breaks, decent breaks. And it's a recipe for just, you know, burnout and driving people out of the profession. So something has got to give, you know, the flexibility. We've got to find better ways of managing rosters and, you know, dealing with the shortage. But I think we could do a lot to improve the image, if you like, of what nurses do, because when it works, it's magic, absolute magic, and incredibly satisfying. But we need a really imaginative campaign, something that kind of hits the bit of the brain that are so far away from stereotypes, based on real live examples of inspiring role models, because those people are out there. You know them, I know them, lots of people in this room know them. So let's get together and commission something that's really going to help people see the beauty box of what nurses actually do. It was almost happening, we thought, with the pandemic, and then the moment passed and it's snapped back again. But, thanks for your question. And your husband and the the supplier-led kind of ethos of the professional dominance in the NHS, I think that's a bit unkind. I think, people come into these professions, because they're generally motivated by meaningfulness, actually wanting to do something meaningful with their lives and make a difference. And, healthcare is a way of making a very material and tangible difference to people's lives. It can be a really hard shift to do that, and it's a huge, towering task at times to actually get enough time to invest as you would wish. And we all know there's a lot of risk management and rationing goes on in the system, which leads to dissatisfaction. But nevertheless, I do think people generally come in with, the best of intentions, and they're not wanting to rip off the NHS. And, it be a kind of platform for their own sort of vanity or whatever, and, megalomania. So I'm being Pollyanna today. You might ask me a different day, and I might have a different answer, but that's my answer at the moment.
Thank you. So one last question. Just over there, lady in the blue jumper.
Thank you. Hello. Sorry, my name is Omniette. I'm an advanced specialist mental health pharmacist, graduate of King's College. My point builds on a little bit on what your husband has said, and it was mostly about positions, like senior positions in the NHS. A lot of people progress and reach the higher positions, but stay there for many, many, many years, and that's usually good and considered retention. Good retention from everywhere, but sometimes they drive older agenda and really struggle to push newer agendas or make room for newer ideas. I wonder if there will be ever a day where the NHS is run a little bit like government, so every 4 years senior positions get to revisit and prove themselves to actually be fit for that position, or actually just create new mindset and invite more talent, as opposed to holding a position for 35 or 40 years. And then whoever is trying to progress to reach these positions, bringing new ideas or thinking out of the box kind of way, it's almost hindered or impossible, which kind of drive people almost to Australia or otherwise everywhere else. And
Thank you.
I also thank you for, I forgot the names, which is your idea about a new campaign where work-life balance and mental health is so high in the agenda, and we have like 2.5 billion coming in for mental health. However, the implementation is quite poor and very little insight into it. And we still have the old culture of we've always done it this way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. I think we've finished. Do you want to answer that one?
Yes, thank you. I mean, here am I defending doctors, and I think that if you think about the changes in medicine, medical practice, I mean, if you take surgery, someone would be trained, in cutting and dissection and so forth many years ago. Now it's keyhole, In fact, Stephen and Tina's son, Ben, is an expert in robotics surgery, in urology. And I'm just kind of awe-inspired and awestruck by how surgeons, doctors, and this would go for, I think, many healthcare practitioners, the pace of change is so fast that, you can barely keep up. And it's not just skills, hands-on, the craft, if you like, of something like surgery. It's all the management changes, the electronic patient record, the processes, digitization. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing. So I'm not sure anyone can stand still long enough to be able to, rest on their laurels. So I really think that most people struggle to keep up with that. But, the best do. I suppose maybe if you get super specialist enclaves, then you might be able to, you might get some challenges, as we saw with, you know, Martha's Law and the Mills family, etc., with, you know, liver and pancreas care, super specialist areas. But I think that's really the exception. And, you know, the thing that keeps impressing me, I've got a friend who's an A&E consultant. I just think, BJ, how do you do it? You know, day after day, all these horrible shifts and dealing with such, you know, violence and trauma. And, you know, she is incredible. And she's one of my greatest friends. And I really look up to her. But that's what the NHS is kind of juicing from people and relying on. And there's just so much, there we say, humanity there. You know, despite the system, we can always do with more. But, you know, I think it's still part of the human condition to want to do your best for people.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Barry, you're going to do a vote of thanks.
Yes. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for a wonderfully comprehensive review of the past, the present, and some thoughts about the future. I think we all are very aware of the impact of austerity on the National Health Service. I think what's brought home to me tonight, amongst other things, is the comparison with Europe and how far we are dropping behind in our healthcare compared with Europe. And your quite stunning statistic, I thought, that the maintenance backlog had doubled in the last 13 years, which is not going to have, to put that right, is not necessarily going to have much of an impact on patient outcomes. I was interested that 77% of the population are of the view that the National Health Service is presently not prepared for future health demands. But then the slide that really struck me was the slide where you showed the difference in attitudes between Tory party supporters, Conservative Party supporters, and Labour Party supporters in what the problem is. And to look to the future, one would somehow have to develop some sort of consensus on what the issues are. Yeah. And we are so far from that consensus. And I was interested in that you ended by looking at possible ways forward. But ultimately, we are dealing with a political issue. And I was wondering, citizens' assemblies, that's something that's not been tried widely other than in Ireland. Royal commissions, which are very much a thing of the past. But somehow, I think you've demonstrated very convincingly that there's got to be some sort of consensus to take us forward. So thank you ever so much. That was incredibly stimulating. We now invite you to join us for a glass of wine or two in the council room. It's very disappointing. We distributed 280 tickets for this evening. And it's always you never know how many you're going to get. We had an overflow room ready if we needed more. But whereas we intended to have the reception in the foyer and the council room, it will now be in the council room, which means that you go out, turn right up the stairs, turn left, and it's immediately on your left. A few of us are wearing badges, which we're members of council. And if you'd like to talk to us about KCLA, what you might help in terms of KCLA, we'd be delighted to talk to you during the reception. And then finally, in the council room, there is the video running that Sue Searle prepared about the KCLA, which was running earlier when there were very few people here prior to the Attlee video, but that will also be running on a loop in the council room. So thank you ever so much for braving the weather and coming, and I hope to have an opportunity to talk to a few of you this evening later. Thank you.